Every nanny quit on CEO's out-of-control twins, until a black woman walked in and changed everything. The sound of slamming doors echoed through the marble hallways of the Whitmore mansion like gunshots. Daniel Whitmore didn't even look up from his laptop screen as he heard the familiar stomping of heels across his pristine white floors. Another nanny making her dramatic exit. "Mr. Whitmore!" The voice was shrill, desperate. "Mr. Whitmore, I quit!" Daniel finally lifted his eyes, his jaw tightening as he saw Sarah Jenkins standing in his office doorway. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was now a mess, mascara streaming down her cheeks in black rivers. Her designer blazer, the one she'd worn so confidently just 3 weeks ago, was stained with what looked like chocolate syrup and glitter. "They're monsters," she gasped, clutching her designer purse like a shield. "Absolute monsters! I have a degree in child psychology from Harvard, and I've never..." Her voice cracked. "I've never encountered children like this." Daniel's fingers drummed against his mahogany desk, the same steady rhythm he used during hostile board meetings. "What happened this time? What happened?" Sarah's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "Your daughter convinced me to try her special smoothie recipe while she filmed it for what she called a cooking show. It was dish soap mixed with hot sauce and expired milk." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, shuddering at the memory. "And your son? He hacked into my phone and sent a text to my ex-boyfriend saying I wanted to get back together." The familiar knot in Daniel's stomach tightened. 6 nannies. 6 highly qualified, well-paid professionals had walked through these doors in the last 10 months, and every single one had left looking exactly like Sarah, broken, bewildered, and ready to call child services. "Look, Sarah, I understand they can be challenging. But surely we can work something out. I'll double your salary. Triple it even. You can have weekends off, use of the Tesla." "No!" Sarah's voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "There isn't enough money in the world. Those children don't need a nanny, Mr. Whitmore. They need an exorcist." With that, she spun on her heel and marched out, her footsteps growing fainter until the front door slammed with such force that the crystal chandelier above Daniel's head tinkled like wind chimes. Daniel closed his laptop and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar pressure building behind his eyes. At 38, he'd built a tech empire worth $3 billion. He'd revolutionized cloud computing, outwitted competitors twice his age, and turned a garage startup into a Fortune 500 company. But 2 children, his own flesh and blood, had defeated him completely. The house fell into its usual eerie quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and wrong in a home where children lived. No laughter, no running feet, no innocent chatter. Just the hum of expensive appliances and the distant sound of classical music playing from hidden speakers throughout the mansion. Daniel walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his meticulously landscaped backyard. Somewhere in this 15,000-square-foot glass and steel monument to his success were Lena and Miles, probably already planning their next attack on whatever unfortunate soul he hired next. His phone buzzed. Margaret, his assistant, always knew when crisis struck. "Sir, I heard about Miss Jenkins. That's number 6 this year." "I'm aware, Margaret." Daniel's voice was flat, emotionless, the same tone he used with incompetent employees and hostile reporters. "Perhaps we need to try a different approach. The agency is running out of candidates. Word travels fast in the nanny community, and frankly, the Whitmore children have quite a reputation." Daniel almost smiled at that. His children were infamous among Seattle's elite childcare providers. The story went that little Lena had once convinced a nanny that she was allergic to water and could only bathe in expensive champagne. Miles had taught their neighbor's dog to steal shoes and hide them in the nanny's car, making it look like she was stealing from other families. "What kind of different approach?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Well, I have a contact who specializes in difficult cases. She's not your typical nanny. No degree from fancy universities, no resume full of children and celebrity families. But she has something else. Which is an old-school approach. She's from the South originally, taught in public schools for 30 years before she started private childcare. Her name is Lorna May Hill, and she's available immediately. Daniel hesitated. He tried everything else: Mary Poppins types with British accents, strict German disciplinarians, even a former military officer who'd lasted exactly 4 days before Lena had somehow convinced her that the house was haunted. Fine. Set up the interview. Actually, sir, she doesn't do interviews. She prefers to meet the children first, get a feel for the situation. Says she can tell within an hour whether she's the right fit. Daniel felt his control freak instincts bristling. He interviewed everyone, from janitors to celebrities. No one walked into his house without being thoroughly vetted, background checked, and approved by him personally. But as he heard a crash from upstairs followed by muffled giggling, he realized he was out of options. How soon can she be here? She's driving up from Portland tomorrow morning. Should arrive around 10. After hanging up, Daniel poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, his father's favorite scotch that he kept for the worst days. The liquid burned going down, but it was nothing compared to the burning shame he felt every time he looked at what his children had become. He'd given them everything money could buy. The best schools, the finest clothes, toys that other kids could only dream of. Their bedrooms looked like toy stores, their closets like high-end boutiques. He bought them horses they never rode, piano lessons they skipped, and art supplies they used to torment their caretakers. But somewhere along the way, in building his empire and securing their financial future, he'd forgotten to build a relationship with them. Work calls during dinner, business trips during school plays, board meetings instead of bedtime stories. He told himself he was providing for them, securing their future, being a responsible father. The truth was simpler and more painful. He didn't know how to be around them. After their mother died in a car accident 3 years ago, the house had become a museum of grief. He'd thrown himself deeper into work, hoping that success could somehow fill the void that Lisa's death had left in all their lives. Now his children were strangers living in his house, and he was paying other people to love them because he'd forgotten how. As night fell over Seattle, casting long shadows through the mansion's countless windows, Daniel stood alone in his office, wondering if this Lorna May Hill would be any different. Or if she'd end up like all the others, running from his house with tears in her eyes and stories about the monster children who lived behind gates of gold. Upstairs, he could hear muffled voices and the sound of something being dragged across the floor. His children were probably planning their next elaborate scheme, their next test for the new adult who dared enter their fortress of anger and abandonment. Tomorrow would bring another chance, another potential failure. But for the first time in months, Daniel felt a tiny spark of something he'd almost forgotten: hope. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. The bourbon glass sat empty on his desk as Daniel finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, past the closed doors of his children's rooms, toward another sleepless night filled with regret and the echo of slamming doors. The next morning arrived with Seattle's typical gray drizzle, and Daniel found himself pacing his office like a caged tiger. At exactly 10 a.m., the doorbell chimed, not the usual frantic knocking of desperate nannies, but a calm, patient ring that somehow commanded respect. When Daniel opened the massive front door, he had to look down slightly. The woman standing on his doorstep was maybe 5'4", with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a simple floral print dress that looked like it came from a department store, not a designer boutique. She carried a wicker basket that smelled like heaven and wore sensible black shoes that had clearly walked many miles. "You must be Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying the warm molasses drawl of the deep south. "I'm Lorna May Hill, but you can call me Miss Lorna. I brought banana bread." Daniel blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Every other nanny had arrived with leather portfolios, references, and nervous energy that screamed desperation for his approval. This woman looked at him like she was sizing up whether he deserved her time, not the other way around. "Please come in." He stepped aside, watching as she took in the soaring ceilings, the crystal chandelier, and the stark white marble that made the foyer feel more like a museum than a home. My, she murmured, but not in the odd tone he usually heard. This place sure is clean. Before Daniel could respond, a thunderous crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by maniacal laughter. He winced, his stomach knotting with familiar dread. Sounds like someone's having fun, Miss Lorna said mildly, adjusting her grip on the basket. Mind if I introduce myself? Without waiting for permission, she walked toward the sound of chaos, her sensible shoes clicking purposefully against the marble. Daniel hurried after her, already composing the apology he'd give when she fled like all the others. In the kitchen, 12-year-old Miles had apparently decided to create modern art using pancake batter, syrup, and what looked like an entire container of sprinkles. The expensive Italian marble island was covered in a rainbow of destruction, while 10-year-old Lena sat perched on the counter, filming with an iPad and providing commentary like a nature documentary narrator. Here we see the wild Miles in his natural habitat, Lena said in a dramatic British accent, creating chaos where order once reigned. She stopped mid-sentence when she spotted Miss Lorna. Miles, sensing the change in atmosphere, slowly turned around, pancake batter dripping from his hands like some sugary crime scene evidence. For a moment, nobody moved. Daniel held his breath, waiting for the explosion, the demands for higher pay, the threats to call child services. Instead, Miss Lorna set down her basket, rolled up her sleeves, and surveyed the damage with the calm expression of someone who'd seen much worse. Well, she said, pulling ingredients from her basket. Looks like y'all started breakfast without me. That's all right, sugar, but you're doing it all wrong. Miles's mouth fell open. Excuse me? The batter, Miss Lorna continued, completely unbothered by his aggressive tone. You're mixing it counterclockwise. That's why it's so lumpy. And honey, she turned to Lena, if you're gonna film a cooking show, you need better lighting. That angle makes everything look flat. The twins exchanged glances, the first time Daniel had seen them actually communicate instead of compete in months. We weren't making a cooking show, Lena said, her voice sharp with the entitled attitude that had sent 6 nannies running. We were making a mess. Obviously. Miss Lorna began pulling out flour, eggs, and cornmeal from her seemingly bottomless basket. Well, since we're already messy, might as well make something useful out of it. You want to help me make some real cornbread, or are you gonna keep pouting like wet cats? Miles stepped forward, his jaw set in that stubborn line Daniel knew all too well. Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but we don't cook. We have people for that. Miss Lorna looked up from measuring cornmeal, and for the first time, Daniel saw something flicker in her warm brown eyes, not anger, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe? Understanding. Sugar, she said softly. I've been cooking since I was younger than you. My grandmother taught me in a kitchen smaller than your pantry, and I've been teaching kids to cook for 30 years. But if you'd rather stand there acting ugly while I make something that'll taste like your great-grandmother's love, that's your choice. Something in her tone, not pleading, not challenging, just matter-of-fact, made both children freeze. No adult had ever spoken to them like this before. Not like they were problems to be solved or obstacles to be overcome, but like they were actual people capable of making good decisions. Lena slid down from the counter, her iPad forgotten. What kind of cornbread? The kind that makes your house smell like home. Miss Lorna replied, handing her a wooden spoon. Miles, you can help or you can keep standing there looking like you swallowed a lemon. Makes no difference to me. For the first time in months, maybe years, Daniel watched his son hesitate instead of immediately choosing rebellion. Miles looked at the mess he'd made, then at Miss Lorna's calm, patient face, then at his sister already mixing batter with more focus than she'd shown for anything in recent memory. Fine, he muttered, moving closer. But I'm not cleaning up. Miss Lorna smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and somehow made the sterile kitchen feel warmer. Oh, honey, cleaning up is part of cooking. But we'll worry about that later. Right now, we're making magic. As Daniel watched from the doorway, something unprecedented happened in his house. His children began working together instead of against each other, guided by a woman who treated them like the people they could become instead of the problems they'd been. 3 weeks later, Miss Lorna had settled into the Whitmore mansion like morning sunshine finding its way through heavy curtains. But as she moved through the sprawling rooms each day, she noticed things that made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. The house was beautiful, magazine perfect really, but it felt like a museum where people happened to sleep. No family photos smiled from the mantelpiece, no crayon drawings decorated the refrigerator, no scuff marks on the walls told stories of children running and playing. Every surface gleamed with the sterile perfection of a showroom, cold and untouched by real life. She found Daniel in his office most evenings, still dressed in his expensive suits, fingers flying across his laptop keyboard even at 9 p.m. When he spoke to Lena and Miles, it was usually to correct their posture, remind them about tutoring schedules, or offer bribes disguised as rewards. "If you keep your grades up this semester, I'll buy you that new gaming system," he'd say to Miles, not noticing how the boy's shoulders sagged. "Lena, proper young ladies don't sit like that," he'd correct, missing entirely how his daughter's face would close off like shutters slamming shut. Miss Lorna watched it all with the patient eyes of someone who'd seen too many children learn that love came with conditions and price tags. One afternoon, while Miles was at soccer practice he'd begged to quit, Miss Lorna found Lena curled up in the corner of her enormous bedroom, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured garden below. The room looked like a princess fantasy: canopy bed, crystal chandelier, enough toys and clothes to stock a department store. But the little girl in the middle of it all looked lost. "Come here, sugar," Miss Lorna said softly, settling into the uncomfortable antique chair by Lena's vanity. "Let me do something with that beautiful hair of yours." Lena approached cautiously, like a stray cat testing whether it was safe to trust. Miss Lorna's gentle hands began working through the tangles, sectioning the dark hair into neat parts for braiding. "Miss Lorna?" Lena's voice was small, vulnerable in a way she never let the adults in her life see. "Do you think Daddy loves us?" The question hit Miss Lorna like a physical blow. She kept braiding, her hands steady even as her heart broke a little more. "What makes you ask that, honey? He buys us things. Lots of things. But he never..." Lena's voice trailed off, then strengthened with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "He never looks happy to see us. Not the way you do." Miss Lorna finished one braid and started on another, buying herself time to find the right words. "Your daddy loves you more than all the stars in the sky, baby girl. Sometimes grown-ups just forget how to show it right. But why?" And there it was, the question that had been building in Lena for 3 years, ever since her mother died and her father disappeared behind work and grief and emotional walls higher than the mansion's gates. Sometimes when people hurt real bad, they'd put up walls to protect themselves. But those same walls that keep the hurt out also keep the love in. Miss Lorna secured the braid with a soft pink ribbon. "Your daddy's been hurting since your mama went to heaven, and he doesn't know how to let the love back out." That evening, as Miss Lorna tucked Lena into bed, something no adult had done in years, the little girl clung to her with desperate fingers. "Please don't leave," Lena whispered against Miss Lorna's shoulder. "Please don't be like the others." Miss Lorna's throat tightened. "I'm not going anywhere, sweet pea. Not unless you want me to." "Never," Lena said fiercely. "I never want you to go." The next day, Miss Lorna began making small changes. She put a vase of fresh flowers on the kitchen island. She hung one of Lena's watercolor paintings on the refrigerator with a cheerful magnet. She instituted family dinner time, not the formal affairs with place settings and silent eating that Daniel preferred, but real dinners where conversation was encouraged and laughter was welcome. Miles resisted at first, testing her boundaries like he'd tested all the others. But when Miss Lorna asked about his day and actually listened to his answer, really listened, not the distracted nodding that adults usually gave him, something in his defensive posture began to soften. She started taking them on after-school walks around the neighborhood, past houses where other families lived behind windows glowing with warm light. She read them real bedtime stories, not the educational texts Daniel had selected, but tales of adventure and magic that made their eyes shine with wonder. Slowly, impossibly, the sterile mansion began to feel less like a showcase and more like a place where children lived. Where laughter echoed down the marble hallways and the scent of homemade cookies competed with the expensive air fresheners. But Miss Lorna noticed something else, too, the way Daniel watched from doorways, his face unreadable but his eyes hungry for something he'd forgotten how to ask for. The way he lingered near the kitchen during their after-school baking sessions, pretending to check emails while really listening to his children's voices filled with genuine joy. The house was changing, one small act of love at a time. But the hardest heart to reach, Miss Lorna was beginning to realize, might not belong to the children at all. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening, when Daniel walked into his kitchen to find it transformed into something he barely recognized. The sterile marble island was dusted with flour, mixing bowls sat in the sink, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Lena's latest painting, a vibrant mess of colors that supposedly depicted their family, hung proudly on the refrigerator next to a shopping list written in Miss Lorna's careful handwriting. But what stopped him cold was the sound of his children's laughter drifting from the living room, where Miss Lorna was teaching them some card game that involved a lot of giggling and playful accusations of cheating. It was a sound he'd forgotten existed in his house. "Miss Hill." His voice cut through the warmth like a blade through silk. "Could I speak with you privately?" The laughter died instantly. Miss Lorna looked up from her cards, her expression calm but alert, like she'd been expecting this moment. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Children, why don't you practice that song I taught you while your daddy and I have a little chat?" In his office, Daniel closed the door and turned to face the woman who had somehow upended his carefully controlled world in less than a month. She stood with her hands folded, waiting, not intimidated by his power or his money or the cold authority that made grown men tremble in boardrooms. "I need to be clear about something," Daniel began, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "You're not their mother. You're an employee. And I need you to remember your place." Miss Lorna tilted her head slightly, studying him with those perceptive brown eyes that seemed to see right through his expensive suit to the scared, broken man underneath. "And what exactly is my place, Mr. Whitmore? Your job is to supervise my children, ensure they're fed and safe, and maintain order in this house. It's not to redecorate my kitchen or fill their heads with." He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the sounds of his children being children. "Whatever this is." "You mean happiness?" Miss Lorna's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath now. "Love? The feeling that they matter to someone? I provide for them," Daniel snapped, his composure cracking. "They have everything they could possibly need. Private schools, tutors, opportunities that most children can only dream of. Everything except a parent who doesn't leave." The words hung in the air like a slap. Daniel felt his chest tighten, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the quiet truth in her voice. "I don't pretend to be their mother," Miss Lorna continued, stepping closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But someone has to be the adult who doesn't leave. Someone has to show them that love isn't something you earn through good grades or perfect behavior. Someone has to prove that they're worth staying for." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't understand. After Lisa died, His voice broke, and he turned away, staring out the window at his perfect, empty garden. Miss Lorna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of old grief that made Daniel turn back to look at her. "I had a son once," she said softly. 17 years old, smart as a whip, funny as anything. Cancer took him when he was just starting his senior year of high school." Her eyes grew distant, seeing something Daniel couldn't. "For 2 years after he died, I couldn't bear to be around children. Couldn't teach, couldn't even look at a school without falling apart." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of shared pain. "But you know what I learned?" Miss Lorna continued, her voice growing stronger. "Grief isn't love. Grief is what happens when love has nowhere to go. And those babies upstairs, they need somewhere for your love to go before it turns into something that hurts them instead of heals them." "I don't know how," Daniel whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I don't know how to be what they need." "You don't have to know how," Miss Lorna said gently. "You just have to start. One dinner conversation. One bedtime story. One moment where you choose them over your fear of losing them." From the living room came the sound of Lena and Miles practicing the song Miss Lorna had taught them, their young voices harmonizing in a way that made Daniel's throat tight with emotion. Without realizing it, both he and Miss Lorna had moved toward the door, drawn by the sound of his children's joy. "They heard us talking, didn't they?" Daniel asked, suddenly understanding why the house had gone so quiet during their conversation. Miss Lorna nodded. "Children always know more than we think they do." In that moment, Daniel realized that his children had been listening not just to their argument, but to Miss Lorna's story about losing her son. They'd heard someone else admit to loving and losing, someone else who understood that grief and love could exist in the same heart. The sound of their singing grew louder, more confident, as if they were trying to fill the silence with something beautiful. And for the first time in 3 years, Daniel felt the walls around his heart begin to crack. The call came at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the Whitmore household. Daniel was in the middle of a conference call with investors when his phone buzzed with a number he recognized: East Side Preparatory Academy, Miles's school. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Principal Morrison. I'm afraid Miles has been involved in an altercation. We need you to come in immediately." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What kind of altercation?" "He was in a physical fight with another student." "I'm sorry, but we have no choice but to suspend him for the remainder of the week." When Daniel arrived at the school, he found Miles sitting in the principal's office with a split lip and knuckles scraped raw. The boy's usual defiant smirk was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he stared at the floor with the hollow expression of someone who'd stopped caring about consequences. "What the hell were you thinking?" Daniel's voice echoed off the office walls as they drove home, his anger masking the fear that twisted in his gut. "Do you have any idea what this could do to your record? To your chances of getting into a decent high school?" Miles said nothing, just pressed his bruised face against the car window and watched Seattle blur past. At home, Daniel's fury reached its breaking point. "You're grounded. No friends, no games, no anything until I decide you've learned your lesson. And you can forget about that camping trip with your class next month." "Fine," Miles mumbled, already heading for the stairs. "I'm not finished." Daniel's voice cracked like a whip. "You think this is a game? You think acting like some street thug is going to get you attention? Well, congratulations, you have mine. And you're going to hate every second of it." That's when Miss Lorna appeared, drawn by the shouting. She took one look at Miles's battered face and Daniel's rage-flushed features, and stepped between them like she was defusing a bomb. "Miles, honey, go wash that cut on your lip and put some ice on it," she said softly. "Your daddy and I need to talk." "Miss Hill, this doesn't concern," Daniel began. "It concerns me plenty," she interrupted, her voice carrying an authority that made even Daniel pause. "Miles, go on. I'll be up to check on you in a minute." After Miles disappeared upstairs, Miss Lorna turned to face Daniel with fire in her eyes that he'd never seen before. "Did you even ask him why he was fighting? It doesn't matter why. It matters everything." Her voice rose for the first time since she'd been in their house. "That boy came home with a split lip and pain in his eyes, and the first thing you did was make him feel worse about himself than he already did." Daniel felt his control slipping. "He needs to learn that actions have consequences." "What he needs," Miss Lorna said, stepping closer until she was looking up into his face with blazing intensity, "is for his father to ask what happened before deciding he's guilty. What he needs is for someone to care more about his pain than their own reputation." "I do care." "No, you don't." The words exploded from her with the force of years of watching broken children in broken homes. "You care about your image, your control, your perfect little world where everything looks right from the outside. But you don't see what's right in front of you." She pointed toward the stairs where Miles had disappeared. "That boy doesn't act wild because he's spoiled, Mr. Whitmore. He acts wild because he's invisible. Both of them do. They break things and cause chaos because it's the only way they know to get you to actually look at them instead of through them. Daniel staggered backward as if she'd physically struck him. That's not. I provide for them, Money isn't love. Miss Lorna's voice cracked with emotion. Expensive schools and fancy toys aren't substitutes for a father who shows up to their lives with his whole heart. They don't need your credit card, they need you. The house fell silent except for the sound of Daniel's ragged breathing. Upstairs, he could hear the faint sound of Lena's door opening, then closing again. She'd been listening, just like always. You want to know why Miles was fighting? Miss Lorna's voice had dropped to a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Because some kid at school called me his fake nanny mama and said you only hired me because you were too important to raise your own children. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. That boy fought to defend me, to defend the only stable love he's had in 3 years. And you punished him for it without even asking why. Tears ran down Miss Lorna's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. He protected someone who loves him, and you made him feel ashamed of it. Daniel sank into the nearest chair, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume he'd been wearing to play a part he didn't understand. For the first time, he saw his children through Miss Lorna's eyes, not as problems to be managed or reflections of his success, but as two heartbroken kids who'd been trying to get their father's attention the only way they knew how. What do I do? He whispered, the question torn from the deepest part of his soul. How do I fix this? Miss Lorna wiped her eyes and looked toward the stairs where both children were undoubtedly listening to every word. You start by going upstairs and having a real conversation with your son. Not about consequences or lessons, but about how he's feeling and why he thought defending our family was worth getting hurt for. Our family. The words hit Daniel like lightning, illuminating everything he'd been too afraid to see. For the first time in 3 years, he understood what he'd lost when he stopped being a father and started being a provider. And for the first time since Lisa died, he felt ready to find his way back. 6 months later, the Whitmore mansion buzzed with a kind of energy it had never known before. Laughter echoed from the kitchen where Lena stood on a step stool, carefully measuring flour while Miss Lorna guided her hands. The refrigerator door was a riot of color, finger paintings, spelling tests with gold stars, and a family photo from their camping trip to Mount Rainier, all held up by an assortment of cheerful magnets that would have horrified Daniel's interior designer. The photo showed 4 people around a campfire, Miles grinning with chocolate smeared on his cheek, Lena leaning against Miss Lorna's shoulder, and Daniel, actually smiling, his expensive suits traded for hiking boots and flannel. It was the first family photo they'd taken since Lisa's death, and it sat proudly next to Lena's latest masterpiece, a watercolor of their house that somehow managed to make the glass and steel structure look warm and welcoming. Daddy, you're burning the bacon! Lena called out, giggling as Daniel frantically flipped the strips in the pan. Saturday morning breakfast had become their sacred ritual. No phones, no work emails, just the 4 of them creating controlled chaos in the kitchen. I'm not burning it, I'm caramelizing it, Daniel protested, earning snorts of laughter from Miles, who was setting the table with the good china because Miss Lorna insisted that everyday moments deserved to feel special. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first conversations between Daniel and his children had been awkward, stilted affairs filled with long silences and tentative questions. But Miss Lorna had been patient, teaching Daniel the same lessons she taught his children, that love was a skill that improved with practice, that being present mattered more than being perfect. Miles had started playing piano again, filling the house with music instead of chaos. His compositions were surprisingly sophisticated for a 12-year-old, and Daniel had learned to sit quietly in the doorway, listening to his son pour his heart into the keys. They'd started having man-to-man talks during their evening walks around the neighborhood, conversations about school, friends, and the complicated business of growing up that Daniel had never thought he'd be capable of navigating. Lena had discovered a love for journaling, filling notebook after notebook with stories and observations that revealed a surprisingly wise and compassionate heart. She'd started leaving little notes, for everyone, encouraging messages for Miles before big tests, reminders for Miss Lorna to take her vitamins, and simple "I love you" cards slipped under Daniel's office door on particularly stressful days. The house itself had transformed along with its inhabitants. The sterile perfection had given way to lived-in warmth. There were scuff marks on the marble floors from sock skating competitions, fingerprints on the previously pristine windows, and the lingering sense of homemade bread and Miss Lorna's famous chocolate chip cookies. Daniel worked fewer hours now, arriving home by 6 most evenings to join their dinner conversations. He'd learned to ask about their days and actually listen to the answers, to celebrate small victories and provide comfort during disappointments. The conference calls that used to stretch into the night were now firmly boundaries by bedtime story hour, a tradition he'd reclaimed from the parade of dismissed nannies. The real test had come at his company's annual dinner, a stuffy affair where Seattle's business elite gathered to network and impress each other. Daniel had brought his whole family for the first time, and when one of his competitors had made a snide comment about the help, referring to Miss Lorna with barely concealed disdain, Lena had stepped forward with the fierce pride that only children possess. "She's not the help," Lena had said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "She helped raise us. She's family." The moment had been both mortifying and magnificent, watching his 10-year-old daughter defend the woman who had saved their family with the same courage that Miles had shown in his school fight. Daniel had felt his chest swell with pride, not for their perfect behavior or impressive accomplishments, but for their loyalty and love. Now, as they sat around the breakfast table sharing stories about their week, Daniel caught Miss Lorna's eye across the chaos of syrup-sticky plates and excited chatter. She was wiping her hands on the floral apron she always wore, the same gesture he'd seen her make 1,000 times, but this morning it struck him with overwhelming gratitude. "Miss Lorna," he said quietly, waiting until she looked up. The words came harder than any business presentation he'd ever given, thick with emotion he was still learning to express. "Thank you? For everything. For them. For us." She smiled, that same warm smile that had welcomed him into his own home 6 months ago, and reached across the table to pat his hand with fingers that smelled like vanilla and home. "You raised them too, Daniel," she said softly, using his first name like she had taken to doing when it was just family. "You just needed a little warmth to get started." As morning sunlight streamed through windows that now showcased children's artwork instead of expensive emptiness, Daniel realized that Miss Lorna had given them something more precious than order or discipline. She'd given them back to each other. She'd turned a house full of strangers into a family full of love. And for the first time since Lisa died, Daniel Whitmore felt like he was finally home.